If we were not part of APEC or if we were not invited to G20, what would that mean, right? It would just mean that we lose the seat at the table. We're not able to advocate for ourselves. Yeah. And when we cannot advocate for ourselves, people would pass us by. For us as a small nation, it's even more important, I think, because losing this seat at the table and losing this relevance presents like actually an existential risk.
Hello, welcome to Local Politics. My name is Vanan. Hello, Dan.
Vanan, welcome back. It's nice to see you again.
This time in person.
Yeah. Quite a few episodes now we've done online, and I've missed you, man.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really nice.
I missed the scene. I've missed producer Marcus and his team.
And the team.
And the team, yeah. So Ashley's here. Winters is here.
Good. It's good to be back.
Yeah. You've been on a whirlwind.
Yeah.
And geopolitically many parts of the world. And, I think we've talked about where you've been, but maybe you can just remind us of your insane trip you just took.
Wow. I went from Singapore to Dubai, Dubai to London, London to Marrakesh, Marrakesh to the Sahara Desert somehow. From the Sahara back to Casablanca, Casablanca to Frankfurt, Frankfurt to Dublin, Dublin to London, London to Athens, and finally back home.
Yeah. And throughout this trip, how many times did you tell people you're from Singapore?
All the time.
Yeah.
And you know what?
Yeah.
That was one of the highlights of the trip, where the moment I said I was from Singapore, or I'm a Singaporean, whether it's a farmer in Ireland or a souvlaki shop in Athens, we were...
Or in your case, many souvlaki shops.
Many souvlaki shops.
Yeah, you can tell.
Wow. People knew Singapore. People knew, or were excited to talk about Singapore and maybe what makes Singapore. Particularly when they see a brown fella talking about Singapore, I think that gets people really going. And
I think it's particularly interesting because I think we're both of the age, right, where maybe even 15, 20 years ago, or even when I went to university in the United States, and I'm sure when many other Singaporeans went abroad in the early 2000s or even the late 90s, if you said you were from Singapore, people would ask, where in China is that? How close is that to Hong Kong?
Yeah.
So the understanding of what Singapore is, right, is obviously a lot more sophisticated, a lot more mature in the world now.
Yeah.
And so you saw that in this trip, and I think we've seen that in our own work trips that we've taken a lot in the last year.
Yeah.
And
I remember when I first went to London, people thought we were just F1 circuits. Well,
pretty much the same size as one sometimes.
Yeah. And it's absolutely grown, but I think that brings in quite nicely to kind of what we want to discuss today. Yeah. And it's this role that Singapore has, and I think will have, and how it manages its geopolitical ties, relationships, multilateralism, bilateralism. These are things we're going to talk about today. But centered around these two events, right, that we've been talking about. You're going to talk a little bit about APEC because PM Wong was there, and then I'll talk a little bit about G20.
Because PM Wong was there too.
Because PM Wong was there too. But it's going to be we don't want this to be a dry topic because it does involve a level of understanding what different players internationally are doing, but we'll try and bring this back to Singapore, I guess.
To be fair, a level of sophistication of geopolitics that even I think both of us don't really possess that much of, except being regular pundits of Singapore.
Sure.
Yeah. Look, every year, this time of year, there are a lot of multilateral conferences held throughout the world. And this year, a lot of these were centered in Latin America. So as you alluded to, first there was the APEC conference in Peru, and then there was the G20 conference in Brazil. Both of these multilateral conferences, and maybe we should also explain what multilateral means. It means when leaders from different countries come together and they try to come up or leave the conference with some kind of communique or some kind of, direction for the next year in relation to why they're there, right?
Yeah.
So
primarily when three or more parties come together to agree on a set of norms.
Yeah. Knobs?
Norms.
Okay, I thought you said knobs.
No. Hopefully not.
Yeah, and these multilateral conferences kind of all roll up to Now it's, where are we now? This is November.
Yeah.
Oh God, I'm so tired. It's the end of the year. And these all kind of roll up to January, where there's the big multilateral conference related to trade and economics at the World Economic Forum in Davos. I'm not sure if you know much about that.
Yes. Our listeners by now would have known this, I think.
And then of course, the UN General Assembly kicks it all off a few months later after that. So we wanted to talk about Singapore's role in the world and its geopolitical strength and why it's relevant in relation to these two topics. So I had the heady task of talking about APEC, and I think it's something that people might be curious about now because PM Wong also announced that APEC will be coming to Singapore in 2030, or Singapore at least will host and be the chair of APEC in 2030.
Right.
And what is APEC? Basically, it is a trade organization. The long form name is, as I read here, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. There are 21 members, and the big players in this are the United States. China is also a member, Japan, Australia. And Singapore, being 1 millionth, basically the size of the other countries combined together, is also a member and on equal footing. That's one of the benefits of being in APEC, that all members are on equal footing. And actually, APEC is a pretty significant group of countries to belong to because it accounts for 60% of global GDP, these 21 countries.
Right.
And APEC's goal is to promote free trade around the world, right? And similar to G20, it's consensus-based. So what happens is the chair basically writes up a communique, which is the fancy word of saying, I guess, document, and it takes an input from all the members, and all members have to agree. So it's a consensus of what is happening here. So we were a part of it this year. We're part of it, and we're going to host it in 2030.
If I'm not wrong, this was Lawrence Wong's first attendance in the APEC Summit as a Prime Minister?
I mean, he's only been... It's the first APEC since he was Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And I think it's this APEC has come at a very interesting time, right? G20 as well, where even though he wasn't there, President Donald Trump, who is famously a nationalist and not a globalist, right? He's pulling back from a lot of global trade deals. He wants to see a lot more trade come back to the US. He's not very into free trade. And then on the other hand, Xi Jinping made some statements that were very pro-free trade. So, the global geopolitics of trade and economics have played out over these two programs. And it's important for PM Wong to be there and be part of it.
It's probably an understatement to say that Donald Trump is against free trade, right? I remember when he went on the Joe Rogan podcast, he said, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff. Tariff. So, I mean, I think that tells you the different spheres that we're looking at in this trade conversation.
Yeah. And, because the way the geopolitics of trade is changing, it's very important for Singapore to remain involved, right? Singapore relies on free trade basically to grow. And I think quite a figure that is very telling is that more than 300% of our gross domestic product, so that's the amount of money that Singaporeans earn. So 300% of our GNP comes from, 300% of our GDP comes from our trade exports. So if multilateralism and free trade continues to decline and more barriers to free trade were to occur, and Singapore's relevance as a free trade zone or transshipment port were to decline, that would spell significant trouble for us. But being there isn't just about talking about trade. It's about expanding our network with other bilateral countries and showing the world that we still matter geopolitically, especially in a time where we have a new prime minister, and definitely he's going to be tested a lot by our neighbors, close and far. And so going there and showing his presence and being felt is very important. And that's probably why he has offered to host and chair 2030 here, right? Because APEC is one of the few opportunities, even though it's 6 years away, it's one of the few opportunities where a country like Singapore can Singapore's leaders, not just PM, but the rest of the cabinet, will play a significant role in negotiating what's going to happen to the world over the next decade. So I think it's a really important thing for Singaporeans to understand the relevancy of this.
Yeah, gotcha.
What about G20? What did you see about it?
Yeah, not too dissimilar to what you have described. After he attended APEC, PM Wong, he went over to Brazil to attend the G20. So what is the G20? It basically comprises 19 major economies, and an addition of the EU and African Union. And this year, their big kind of, let's say, tagline that they wanted to focus on was to eradicate poverty and try to reduce inequality.
Sure. I mean, but that's every multilateral event.
And I think that is something that we will be discussing a little bit later, right? So obviously the first thing that came up in my mind is Brazil it's been maybe infamous for having significant food security issues and definitely widening inequality. And then to have it in Brazil and try to get a kind of global consensus on doing this, seemed a little bit strange as I was reading through it. I must admit that, I've always known about the G20, but never quite fully understood what is it that they've done, right? So they actually started in 2008. I mean, for the real history buffs out there, they actually started in 1999. And this was right after the Asian financial crisis. But this meeting was only for finance ministers, people who were involved in the financial districts. But very quickly, right after the GFC, in 2008, they convened one for national level leaders to come and have discussions around this. Yeah. So, as I've said, the 19 biggest economies, they constitute 85% of global GDP and 60% of the world's population. Singapore is not a member of the G20, but we have been invited ever since 2010. And I think since 2013, we've been there or thereabouts in some capacity. Yeah. Till 2023, and 2024 we got invited again. I think for Singaporeans who are listening to this, right, why is it important? One of the main reasons why we got invited to G20 was because we convened the Global Governance Group, 3G. We did this in 2019, and it's basically a grouping of 30 small and medium-sized states. And we have side discussions with these states, and we try to promote medium and small-sized states in these discussions. And I think in G20, as I was looking through what is it that they try to do, they try to make various kinds of discussions. They try to unpack the kind of macroeconomic global trends, the kind of challenges that people are facing. And they try to agree on what the next steps in terms of actions should be, right? Yeah. That's important, like you said. Yeah. Like in APEC, it's better to be there than not be there. PM Lawrence Wong, that was one of the things that he said at his doorstop CNA interview. Yeah. He said, if you're not at the table, then you'll probably be on the menu. So, this kind of cutthroat world of negotiations, of diplomacy, and having this side bilateral chats, it's more important than maybe we even take it in this side of the world.
I think, we can talk about what APEC and G20 is, but the key thing I think we wanted to address today and maybe have a conversation about is why is it so significant that Singapore maintains its, I guess, identity as a country that can be invited to these things or host these things, compared to, I guess, what you alluded to, if we're not there, what would happen to us, right? Yeah. I think one of the things that APEC has helped Singapore do is, because we have hosted it before, we were the chair in 2009. And actually, when we were the chair, it was the first APEC that was held right after the financial crisis that, devastated everyone, including most of us in this room.
Before we went to the break, I also just wanted to, talk a little bit about these institutions, these conversations that happen. Yeah. It's actually non-binding. There is no legal framework for countries when they put out what they say to actually do.
Kind of like COP, right?
Exactly. And that's the other big one that we haven't really spoken about, even though it's happening right now. And, there is a kind of policy outcome hangover, particularly with people who follow this or people who expect some kind of resolutions to take place. And those are not actually happening, irrespective of, who might host it and some of the ideas that are presented. I think the critics around this G20 that Lawrence Wong attended, they're saying that, you wanted to end hunger, you wanted to put an end to poverty, you wanted to drastically reduce inequality. Climate change was on the agenda, and they expected so much more. And at the end of the day, it seems like nothing really had materialized from this.
Yeah.
In fact, Lawrence Wong, when he was at the G20, I was looking through some of the interviews that he did. A lot of his, conversations and remarks was very much centered around trade, right? And how to protect Singapore's interests at a time where multilateralism is kind of fading and weaning away. So it seems like trade definitely centered around this.
Yeah.
But a lot of other issues that people are concerned about, probably not as much discussed.
Yeah. I definitely take that point. I mean, there are so many institutions like this around the world that people use, and I think there are different ways to look at this, right? I mean, on one hand, it is very easy to be cynical and disappointed, and I think it's right to be cynical and disappointed on one level. I think there are a lot of constraints as well, right? And again, I am by no means, in fact, I'm negative in terms of geopolitical sophistication. But I can imagine a situation where, you are a powerful country or a powerful group of countries, and you're trying to bring different countries together in this very inorganic way. And if you get all these countries with very different interests, very different stakes in how things play out, and force them to agree to a binding communique, they just won't show up. So while there is no perfect solution out there based on today's world, right? I mean, maybe one day the aliens will come and save us. But without divine intervention or UFO intervention, I don't think it is. I find it hard to see a scenario where we can find any institution that will actually bring all people to the table and also get people to commit in a way that is binding. I mean, it's just not realistic. And so, for a country like Singapore, what are we to do, right? Are we here to bang the drum about what is ethically the best and the most correct thing for the world? I think in some way that's the responsibility of everyone, including us. But on another level, Singapore, as a small country, we have our own interests, right? Which is to act big and be big and be relevant. And so for us, these are, I still think these are very useful organizations to make sure we get invited back to. And the other thing that we have to remember is that, Singapore, we are a victim to what's happening in the global world, right? If tariffs are higher on China or other parts of the world, and there's this, these two awful wars happening in the Middle East and in Ukraine, Singapore's exports have come down by over 4% year on year, right?
Not all exports.
Yeah, and that's a really big issue, right? Because the production of these exports, I mean, we do a lot of value-added services and we do a lot of R&D, and if 4% of our exports are coming down, then that's a lot of people who might find themselves out of work, and so it's very important that we bang this drum about why it's so important to be engaged in free trade.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you. I think both things can be true, right? I think you're right. I think Lawrence Wong has got a really important role here, not just to be attendance at G20 and APEC, but to also talk about the need for us to have trade. We are solely dependent on everything that happens outside of Singapore. So I think absolutely that's important. But as we are talking about these issues and the need for having this kind of international conversations, particularly if you're a small country like Singapore, I think when Lawrence Wong kind of spoke about this, he alluded to the fact that multilateralism is winning. It's we are going into a trend where generally these traits of having PACs, organizations coming together to solve things, is lower.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and I think it's not just true, but it then points to the global parallels, right, that is at the moment the United States and China. And now, maybe I take the point of view that is slightly different from yours, that yes, I can acknowledge that not having something as opposed to having something is an opportunity cost in terms of the G20 and APEC. But when you have 29 COPs and so many G whatever, there comes a point of time where the hangover to get things done is lost on people. And actions to fix things are now getting more and more pressing. last year or the year before last, when COP happened, they said 1.5 degrees. That is the threshold that not only sustainably and environmentally is a point that we should try our best to stop at, but that the economic ramification cost on that, if we surpass this 1.5, becomes just very unattainable. And we are so close to passing that already.
Yeah.
And when you go to a G20 summit, particularly a country like Singapore that, as we have already alluded to, stands head and above shoulders from where we were 10, 15, 20 years ago. Sometimes the question now becomes, is it important to have a much more focused level of having these conversations? Because the fact that climate change was not even discussed at G20, I think it's morally just not correct. And, fair play for Lawrence Wong to fighting the interests of Singapore, which is absolutely right on trade. But if you want to be seen as a bigger player internationally, I think this goes back to what we'll talk about after the break, the role of small and bigger states. You need to have a say in the big things that matter too.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that point of view, but I would just say this is also the classic problem of a lot of the global North, right? The classic issue of the Western democracies where leaders have very short-term interests. And I mean, this is something we also see a lot in our work with cities, right? Where focusing on these long-term issues, especially in countries where elections are so tight, like the United States. I mean, maybe this one wasn't as tight as we wanted it to be, but people only have 4 years or 6 years to try and retain power. These institutions, I guess, could be doing more to highlighting them. But I take your point.
It's just before we go to the break, I find the use of global North and global South a really contentious issue as I was researching this post. And
thank you.
And I don't think we should label the world in these stratospheres anymore. Actually, I think the needle on global North and global South has changed drastically. I know President Xi Jinping in his G20 address, he talked about China representing the global South, but I think so much has shifted. Just yesterday in the COP29 summit, they said China and India cannot be looked at as developing economies anymore. And this statement of what the global North and global South, I sit in the camp where it needs to change. And why, right? Let's bring the conversation back to Singapore. If we are going to talk about just trade and looking at Singapore's economic successes in the long run, then when we incentivize people in Singapore to think of sustainability, environment, looking at the bigger picture, livability and social cues, people take these cues from these international summits and meetings. There's a trade-off here.
Yeah.
Singaporeans in the past, let the politicians and let leaders representing Singapore take the tough decisions. But I think more and more people are getting involved in the status quo, in the narrative, or even the political and social zeitgeist of the day. And for Lawrence Wong, I think more and more I hope to see that he represents himself and Singapore in that way, but also not shy away from having these difficult conversations at an international level, or at least we can be taken seriously then. Yeah. But I'm sure we'll discuss that after the break.
All right. Before we start yelling at each other, let's cool off.
See you after the break.
Welcome back.
Yeah.
Look, I think what we wanted to do was just dive in on looking at the pointers of why Singapore needs to stay geopolitically relevant.
Yeah.
And also how politics locally impacts our capability to stay geopolitically relevant.
Yeah.
And
you got through that very well. Well done.
Thank you. That was
not easy.
Again, I want to remind everyone, I'm not a geopolitical expert. Yes. I just did some research.
Yes.
Right.
But we are called local politics, so I guess that's a natural reasoning to why we want to draw this back to something more local and contextual.
Sure. Do you want to start? Do you want to give your version of this?
Well, I mean, I think it was nice to see PM Lawrence Wong and how he handled himself in the big stage. This was his first APEC, first G20. And I think all that is well and good. And I think the conversations we were having before we came on to do the pod, right, was we're not in disagreement with each other. It's more, you can have...
Shocker.
Yeah. We can have both things that are true, which is, you want to be looking at trade. You want to be talking about the ramifications. As we said before the break, having a 4% loss would mean literally people losing jobs in Singapore, people losing livelihoods. Both of those, G20 and APEC, I suppose, kind of presents itself after the Asian and global financial crisis. And a lot of instances in the last few years, people are talking about, are we walking through a crisis? What's happening? So I can understand from the local field when you're reading news about G20 and APEC, the conversation will center back in Singaporeans' minds of, how does this affect me?
Yeah, I mean, but let's take play this game. Like, if we were not part of APEC, or if we were not invited to G20, what would that mean, right? Because coming back to this issue of a trade, negative trade growth that we have, it would just mean that we lose the seat at the table. We're not able to advocate for ourselves. Yeah. And when we can't advocate for ourselves, people would pass us by. And some of the conversations that happen at these bilateral events are not just multilateral, but bilateral as well. Yeah. And things that have happened recently, like Singapore and Germany upgrading their trade relations to a strategic partnership, we won't have this. And the tool set that the government has to manage growth or economic resilience in Singapore depreciates. But there are other things that I think are important here as well, because these are also venues for us to make friends. Even though these things are centered around trade, it also presents ourselves an opportunity to talk about other kinds of corporations, security. So so PM met with Xi Jinping, right, and talked about better ties. He also had a call with Donald Trump and congratulated him and invited him to Singapore. Yeah. So these are also other opportunities to make our presence known. And I think any professional would know that, it kind of burns when you don't get invited to the meeting. But for us as a small nation, it's even more important, I think, because losing this seat at the table and losing this relevance presents actually an existential risk. I think not being able to talk about why we stand up for international law, why we don't take strong stances and on things like sovereignty, and for people to listen to us, means that we lose the ability to defend our own space, right? Like, I can imagine a situation where if we didn't have such good ties with other countries in ASEAN, or if we didn't have good ties with some other strong military governments in the West, then it would be much more attractive for people to kind of pick at our door a bit more, right? You'd see more trawlers from neighbor X approach our shores, or you would see neighbor Y try and control the airspace that we control a bit more. And these all things have significant ramifications to, negative 4% trade growth is pretty bad, but losing the capability to be a travel hub in Changi, or losing the capability to safeguard safe passage for ships in Singapore who go to the port. These are all existential crises for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm definitely in agreement with you. We have to be there, otherwise we won't have these partnerships. Besides France, we've got partnerships with Germany. In fact, the Australian environmental minister announced this electricity grid that is going to give us electricity from 2030 onwards. So a lot of different exciting bilateral agreements and discussions, plus all the friendly fireside chats and all of that. However, I think one of the things that I wanted to discuss about is the role moving forward of these multilateral institutions, organizations, conversations, and how Singapore should conduct itself, and vis-a-vis why should that matter for Singaporeans, right? I think that there is a conversation to be had, and I bring this back because for me, what was crucial for both APEC and particularly G20, even to some extent COP29, is who's going to pay for it, right? Ultimately, the conversation centers around the roles played by the United States and China. And their differing attitudes, particularly on development or particularly on finding amicable solutions for a lot of the world's problems, is very much engineered around the way we communicate around G20 events.
Yeah. Look, I don't mean to interject, but that's what I'm saying, right? If we weren't so strong geopolitically, either the United States, actually both, the US or China would say to Singapore, hey, you have to choose one or the other, because you are weak, you can't survive without either of us, so you have to choose one. But right now, we don't have to, right? We are friendly to both. Both sides know our position. Both sides know that actually Singapore acts in its best interest and fairly and honestly according to whatever law to both. And I mean, many examples in the past can be cited for this, right? And which I would mention now. But anyway, basically, I think that's the whole point that I'm trying to make, that if we lose this geopolitical advantage, then we won't be able to be this neutral party or this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I don't think we are in any way of shape or form going to lose this certainty that we have geopolitically.
I think it's not so certain.
Right. Maybe we can talk about that. But we have good relations because of the way we have performed as a country, because of the way we have taken stance on certain things. For example, when we decided to give aid to Gaza, and with the new Trump presidency saying that they will be supporting Israel no matter what, that does put us in a somewhat of a different confrontational pathway with the United States. In the past, with the South China Sea, we have been, in our stance, was slightly different to that of China and its attitude towards the South China Sea. But we dealt with that as a nation because we stuck to the principles that we believed in. And I think that is what stands the test of time. So now what I'm saying is, when we go to these G20 events, besides important discussions that we have on trade, besides the good bilateral meetings that we will continue to have, because with a country of no natural resources and basically a reliance on trade, we can use this as a platform to further integrate ourselves in the wider coalition of conversations.
Sure.
That looks at not just trade, that looks at climate change and things to do around inequality. Lawrence Wong did say in his G20 remarks that he's happy for Singapore to share the reasons behind a lot of the successes that we've had. And a lot of it is, centered around the things that you've already mentioned, right? Staying true to who we are, believing and doing what makes sense for us. Now, saying that on an international stage at the G20, for me, it's a very relevant thing because it is a huge global platform. And I think the discourse in Singapore, among Singaporeans, sometimes they don't follow or watch some of these big events or even take it for granted that we will have this. Because that's lost, that conversational narrative escapes the reality of those implications for Singaporeans in Singapore. And I think that conversation that we need to have is to strengthen those ties and links and make people in Singapore understand that there are ramifications, there are real ramifications that escapes us, even though we might not take these quite seriously.
Okay. I mean, I agree. And I mean, I think that's why I don't think it's a certainty that things go on well from here. And I mean, I just want to play this like scenario-based game where, the government right now has a very strong majority in parliament, right? And by any Western means or consideration, polled pretty well in the last GE. But let's say in the next GE, if they were to lose more seats, if the PAP was to lose more seats at a significant level, then I would be then start to say, if I was like a bilateral partner, for example, and I was being, Singapore was negotiating hard for something, and then suddenly the government that you're negotiating with loses a bunch of seats, loses the power that it has domestically. I think it's very easy for our neighbors who are bigger or have been around a lot longer from us to say, maybe I won't deal with this issue right now. I'll hold it off because maybe you won't be around in 5 years or 10 years anymore, right? I can think of so many issues that could kind of crumble. Water, South China Sea, Pedro Blanca, air flight control. All these things could disappear overnight if somehow the domestic side of the domestic level of security or how government is perceived in domestically was to dissipate. I mean, PM Wong and the 4G could be superstars abroad. And in many ways they are, right? They still are. But if they're not seen that way domestically, it will be seen as a problem.
Just to be clear, as I'm listening to you describe this, are you making the case for the PAP to continue winning the elections and for people to side with the PAP so that we maintain the global status quo and the order that we are strong multilaterally?
I think I want to make the case that the best government in charge, who you think can handle both domestic and international affairs, you should consider how your vote would impact Singapore's geopolitical position and then by thus far its sovereignty and its economic position.
Right. You see, that's a really interesting point when we draw this back to the local politics of things, because I think locally the oppositions that we have, and I'm thinking just the Workers' Party here, not really the PSP because of our already defined opinions on those matters.
No comment.
I don't think on an international scale the Workers' Party would bring Singapore down in any measure of that. And I don't think losing seats or winning seats a little bit more would really change that status quo of order. I do agree with you, though, that any kind of weaknesses, right, that can be anticipated or kind of judged upon by our neighbors will be taken advantage of. That is just the world order, I suppose. But I think we are quite lucky in the sense that we're not America, where one party leaves and another party comes in, and the entire global order around trade and equality changes.
Wait, so you're saying that you think that the WP has a pretty aligned foreign policy agenda with the PAP?
Yeah, in that sense, yeah. I think they believe in having trade. I do think any party in Singapore understands the nature that Singapore is dependent on other countries to survive, that without being part of the global trade order and being an influential member of the WTO, we won't be doing well enough.
But they want to spend more of our reserves. They want to limit they want to have more limits on immigration. They propose other things like, a global minimum wage in Singapore, or they want to reintroduce a flat inheritance tax, things that actually may be populist. I'm not, okay, maybe I don't want to critique anybody, but I'm just saying that I don't think that they're as aligned. Maybe on the surface, it seems like, on the big matters, they are aligned. But when it comes down to the argument on things, these differences do matter.
Yeah, I think you might have a point there. I think there are some of these things where I think they might not be very well sourced, or the information might not be as relevant or as correct as the PAP at times. I think you are right there. I don't disagree with that. But I think in terms of Singapore's stability and role in an international arena and our reliance on having multilateral trade and the benefits that arise to that for Singapore and Singaporeans, I think both parties would say they are on par. I mean, there are many people many different countries who sit on the G20 right now that have very similar attitudes to the Workers' Party, and they're still seen as very important members of the G20.
Yeah, but I mean, they have more than 700 square kilometers and actual natural resources and a hinterland to rely on.
Sure. But just having difference of opinions on some things, to me, is not the same as having different axioms in terms of expectations of trade.
I don't know if it came down to it, right? And someone was like, look, I mean, the ruling party, I mean, let's play a scenario so we don't get in trouble, right?
Sure.
Ruling party X, you've lost 30% of the seats in parliament compared to your previous session, right? So you lost 10 or 15 seats. And because of that, if this trajectory goes, maybe in 10 years, I don't need to worry about you as much as I do. And if this ruling party is trying to renegotiate water, renegotiated flight path, renegotiated key issues related to sovereignty. I mean, again, Pedro Blanca is being brought up again, right?
Yeah.
Why not just like some other country that just wait for these guys for the trend to carry out? I don't think that it's in any opposition's interest to say, actually, I will vote with the ruling party or the current government on a block basis on these foreign issues. I mean, then what's the point of them existing? And I think the last point is that, I'm sure I'll be called out as a PAP shrill or something, but I think the reality is that, I mean, if there was any chance in 15 or 20 years or how many GEs later that there will be a change in government, it's not going to be like just the WP taking over probably, right? I mean, no opposition contests in every seat, right? And what happens if
That's
the
true,
WP and right now the PSP, they combine, form a coalition that can then be the ruling government? I mean, look at the rhetoric that the PSP has been putting out. Super anti-foreigner, super nationalist.
Yeah.
I mean, in many ways, some of the rhetoric around job security and all that is akin to something that maybe Donald Trump might be saying. Okay,
Trumpian. Huh?
I don't want to say that, but maybe, right? I'm not saying one's right or one's wrong, I guess, but I think my only point is that if that were to happen, that would seriously delegitimize or seriously make an impact that would seriously impact Singapore's position, I guess morally, even in being able to talk about free trade.
Sure, I agree with you. I think in any likely scenario where the opposition does come into power in Singapore, I think it does seem like some sort of a coalition between the Workers' Party and the PSP. And yes, I think you're absolutely right. They have had very differing views in terms of foreigners and what that means, and the protection of Singaporeans and what that means. And the kind of, you're right, the kind of message that sends internationally and how Singapore then relays its messages or advocates for trade changes. Absolutely. But at the same time, it kind of goes back to the point that I was making initially, which is that is why when PM Wong goes for these G20 conversations, he doesn't only talk about trade. He doesn't only make it seem like we are just, ticking off some of our interests. He's seen as a bigger player than this, that he looks at much more important issues like inequality, like climate change, because whether we like it or not, those things are at our shores. And I think maybe the message that I've somehow ended up saying, which I now believe in myself also, is if you say the right things internationally and you parade yourselves correctly, then locally you might be also in a better shape to align yourself with those principles. And ultimately, I think Singaporeans can see and then believe it, so that you don't get people who are adverse to whatever that PAP believes in, I suppose, coming into power.
I don't know. I mean, I think that's a very nice, I think that's a very nice thought exercise, but I don't think the applied reality is as direct.
You would say that you're a PAP, sure.
Right. I agree, right? I think, and yeah, sure, G20 and APEC are about trade, but I think we've spoken up about a lot of things that you and I, very liberal or very progressive agendas in many other forums, right? In the UN, in the WEF, in other things. I don't think we've said the wrong things globally.
No, not at all. In fact, I'm very proud of how Lawrence Wong in Singapore has conducted itself.
Yeah, no, I'm glad we're ending on that. And at the end of the day, still domestically, the conversations are about very domestic issues, national level issues, right? Yeah. So my only point is that, and I don't have an answer for this, because if I did, I wouldn't just be a lowly pundit.
Right.
I think that the question is how can we bring this need for the electorate or the importance of our geopolitical standing back to Singaporeans. How do we message that? I don't have an answer.
I think that's a conversation we need to have more openly as a country. Yeah. But it seems like we're doing well so far. So
yes,
well done, PM Wong.
God. Okay.
Well, do you want to close us off?
I always screw it up, but okay, I'll give it a good go. Thanks for listening. We are on all the social media apps. You can watch us now, the full thing, the full episodes on YouTube.
Yeah.
We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're on TikTok, on Instagram. Marcus and the team's been doing a great job with the clips.
Yeah.
And, we are Majula Presents Local Politics.
No answers, just agendas.
All right, see you next time.
See you.